For most of humankind, love is a choice, a spark that grows between hearts. But in Sparta it was commandment. Intimacy was law, dictated not by desire but by decree. The human body was not sacred, not private. It was property of the state, a vessel of duty designed for one purpose only, to forge the perfect warrior. The creation of a Spartan began not in war, but in the bedchamber. Behind the crimson cloaks and shining shields of legend lay something colder, a system of selective breeding so merciless that even nature itself would have flinched. The Spartan state decided who would marry, who would reproduce, and who would die. Old magistrates, men who had survived decades of battle, stood as judges of life. They examined the young like livestock at a market. He was tall, broad-shouldered, born of warriors. She was strong, fertile, her hips wide, her body unyielding. Beauty was not a gift. It was proof, a sign of health, a guarantee of strong blood. Marriage was stripped of emotion. Love was irrelevant. The union between man and woman was a transaction, an exchange of flesh in service of the state. There were no vows of affection, no songs, no tenderness. There was only duty. Each night of intimacy was a contract, a promise to strengthen the bloodline of Sparta. Even the act of conception was public business. The elders arranged and approved each match with the same detachment they might use when forging steel. Once selected, refusal was not permitted. A citizen's body was not his own. His seed, her womb, their offspring, all were property of the city, and if a celebrated warrior's wife failed to conceive, the state intervened again. Another man, younger, stronger, could be ordered to impregnate her. The husband did not protest. He took pride. For in this world, adultery did not exist, only service to the state. Fidelity, love, affection, these were relics of weaker civilizations. The Spartan ideal was purity through control, strength through selection, perfection through obedience. Every birth was a weapon forged for the battlefield. Every child was the future blade of the state. In Sparta, humanity was stripped to its core. The heart was sacrificed to the flag. And so, while the rest of Greece celebrated beauty and freedom, Sparta worshipped something far more dangerous, the science of strength, the tyranny of perfection, and the law of blood. From the moment a Spartan girl took her first step, her fate was sealed. She was not meant to be delicate, nor to please, nor to obey. She was meant to endure. Childhood was not a time for innocence, but for preparation. She ran beneath the burning sun, wrestled in the dirt, hurled javelins into the wind. Every bruise was an offering, every scar a lesson. Her body was not her own. It was a weapon in the service of her people. Spartan women were told that they did not belong to their husbands. They belonged to Sparta. Their worth was not measured in beauty, charm, or kindness, but in strength. Their battlefield was the birthing bed, and their victory was a living, breathing soldier. A woman who gave birth to a strong son was honored. One who could not was forgotten. Those who failed to conceive were not pitied. They were replaced. In the eyes of the state, childbirth was not love, it was war. The greatest duty a woman could perform was to give Sparta another blade to wield. And if her body failed that purpose, the state would act. A stronger man could be chosen to father her child, and her husband was expected to accept it without protest. The act was not betrayal. It was policy. There was no such thing as adultery in Sparta, for there was no such thing as private love. The state-owned desire dictated marriage and managed birth. A woman's womb could be loaned, her body reassigned, her purpose redefined, all in the name of strength. She was a vessel of the nation, not of herself. In this world, tenderness was seen as weakness and affection as distraction. A woman who loved her child too much risked losing sight of her duty. A man who loved his wife risked losing his edge. The family, in its natural form, was viewed as a threat to the unity of the state. Only Sparta deserved devotion, and so, generation after generation, women were sculpted not into mothers, but into monuments of endurance. They carried within them the empire's unyielding will. When a Spartan mother held her newborn, she did not whisper lullabies. She looked into her child's eyes and saw not a son, but a soldier. Every heartbeat, every drop of blood, every future cry on the battlefield was the echo of her sacrifice. In Sparta, love was not forbidden. It was erased, replaced by duty. And through that sacrifice, the city of warriors continued to breed both its strength and its doom. When a Spartan child was born, there were no songs, no feasts, no tears of joy. The air in the birthing chamber was silent, heavy with dread. Because in Sparta, life was not a gift, it was a test. The newborn did not belong to its mother, nor to its father. It belonged to the state, and the state would decide whether it deserved to live. Within hours, the infant was taken from its mother's trembling arms and carried to the lay, the hall of judgment. There the elders of the Gerousia waited in silence. These were not kindly old men. They were warriors who had survived countless battles and seen death in every shape imaginable. Their eyes, cold and calculating, were trained not to feel, as only to measure. They examined each baby as if inspecting a blade. Every limb, every breath, every cry mattered. If the spine was straight, if the legs were strong, if the cry was loud and defiant, the infant was spared. It would be returned to its parents, not as a son but as property of Sparta, a future soldier, claimed by the state before it could even walk. But if the body was frail, if the lungs were weak, if the elders saw even the faintest imperfection, the verdict was death. The weak were not executed by sword or drowned in water. The Spartans called their method the apothete, the deposit. On the cold slopes of Mount Taygetus, a place of jagged stones and howling wind, the unwanted were carried in silence. There was no ceremony, no cruelty, no remorse, just the echo of footsteps on stone. The infant was left on the cliff, exposed to the frost, to the wind, to the beasts that roamed the night. The crying faded with the dawn, and Sparta called it mercy, mercy for the nation. To modern minds it was barbaric, but to the Spartans it was logic. They lived surrounded by enemies, by enslaved helots who outnumbered them 10 to 1. In such a world, weakness was not only shameful, it was fatal. A single fragile life could mean vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death for all. And so the culling continued, generation after generation. Babies born strong lived to fight, to breed, to kill. Babies born weak became nothing more than whispers on the mountain wind. Through this ruthless ritual, Sparta purified itself, forging a race that believed perfection was survival and compassion was treason. At 7 years old, the Spartan boy's childhood ended. His mother did not cry. There were no goodbyes, no tears, no lullabies. She placed her hands on his shoulders, looked into his eyes, and said the only words that mattered: "Return with your shield, or on it." Then she turned away, because in Sparta, love was weakness, and weakness had no place in the state. From that moment, the boy belonged not to his family, but to the agoge, the machine that forged the deadliest warriors the world had ever known. The system broke boys to rebuild them as instruments of discipline, loyalty, and silent cruelty. There were no comforts here, only lessons carved into flesh and mind. He slept on a bed of reeds that he had to tear from the riverbank with his bare hands. No knife, no tool. His tunic was a single rough cloth that he wore year-round through heat, cold, and rain. The purpose was not neglect, it was design. He was meant to suffer. Every ache, every chill, every pang of hunger was a teacher. They starved him deliberately to sharpen his instincts. He learned that food was never given freely. It had to be earned, taken, or stolen. Theft in Sparta was not a crime. Getting caught was. The boy learned to move in silence, to read shadows, to hide his hunger behind a steady gaze. Pain was constant, but failure was worse. When he faltered, punishment came swiftly, the lash across his back, the shame of incompetence. It was never cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was precision. The agoge taught that every mistake had a price, that mercy was poison, that success was the only virtue. In time, he forgot what comfort felt like. He learned to endure pain without flinching, to walk barefoot on frozen earth, to sleep under open skies. When he bled, he did not cry. When he failed, he learned. When he succeeded, he was silent. The agoge was not education. It was conditioning, the slow erasure of the self. Every boy entered as a child and left as something else entirely. The laughter, the dreams, the innocence, all were stripped away and replaced by the discipline of a predator. By the time he reached manhood, the boy no longer remembered his mother's face. He remembered only her final words and the sound of the whip that made him strong enough to live by them. The agoge was not content to conquer the body. It sought dominion over the mind. The boy who had survived hunger and pain would now face something far colder, the war within. Sparta did not want soldiers who spoke carelessly or felt too deeply. It demanded silence, precision, and obedience so complete that even words were weapons. From this discipline came a legacy, the word laconic. Brevity forged in brutality. Every sentence had to strike like an arrow. A foolish remark, an unmeasured thought, was punished immediately. Teachers bit the thumbs of their students, drawing a sharp jolt of pain, a reminder that words carried weight. To speak without thought was to invite suffering. Older boys ruled the younger with the cruelty of miniature tyrants. They enforced the same lessons that had been carved into them. Every meal became an interrogation, every question a trap. Who is the bravest man in Sparta? What do you think of the king's last campaign? There were no right answers, only consequences. A pause too long, a tone too soft, and fists would follow. This was not random bullying. It was calculated psychology, a state-designed crucible meant to forge minds that could withstand interrogation, humiliation, and fear. It was the breeding ground of political predators. The weak learned to obey. The clever learned to manipulate. The ruthless learned to rule, trust no one, expose weakness, hide your own. These were not suggestions, they were commandments. Compassion was treated as a crack in the armor, and hesitation was a sin. Loyalty existed only upward, to the state, to Sparta, to the machine that had replaced their families, and then came the final test, the ritual of agony that marked the birth of a Spartan. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys were lined before the goddess's shrine. On the altar sat cheese and a simple offering, the task to seize it and escape. But between the boys and the altar stood a wall of whips. Leather struck flesh. The air filled with the sound of endurance. Victory was not in the stealing, but in the silence. To scream was shame. To endure was glory. To die smiling was perfection. They called it baptism by blood, the final forging of a Spartan soul. And when the pain ended and the dust settled, what stood there was not a boy but a weapon, silent, unyielding, and carved from the marrow of cruelty itself. Graduation from the agoge did not bring peace. It brought darkness. The boys who had been broken and remade now faced the final test, one that would complete their transformation. Only the strongest, the most cunning, the ones who no longer flinched at cruelty were chosen. They were the Cryptia, the hidden ones, Sparta's silent blade. There were no banners, no ceremonies, no songs. Their selection was whispered, their mission unspoken. At night, these chosen few were summoned to the magistrate's hall. There, under the flicker of torchlight, they were given a dagger, a few scraps of food, and one order: disappear. They were sent into the countryside, where the helots, Sparta's enslaved laborers, worked the fields. These men and women outnumbered the Spartans 10-1. To Sparta, that imbalance was a constant threat, and so the Cryptia were unleashed not to fight battles, but to maintain fear. Before each hunt, the ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, performed a chilling ritual. They declared war on the helots. With a few words, killing became lawful, and murder became duty. Bureaucracy turned into bloodshed, a legal fiction that gave horror the mask of order. The young Cryptes hid by day, moved by night, and stalked those who seemed too bold, too outspoken, too strong. They learned to walk in silence, to kill in silence, to live without remorse. It was not war, it was purification. A ritual of control meant to remind every slave that the state was watching, always watching. There were no witnesses, no songs of glory, no mercy. Each kill was a lesson in detachment. The dagger became an extension of their will. They learned to strike without hesitation, to vanish before dawn, leaving only whispers and fear in their wake. Weeks later, when they returned to the city, their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They no longer trembled at the sight of blood. Their hands did not shake, their hearts did not feel. They had achieved what Sparta demanded, absolute transformation. They were no longer men. They were instruments, tools of terror, sharpened to perfection, designed not to question, not to think, but to execute. In the eyes of the state, they had become ideal Spartans, silent, loyal, efficient. But in the quiet corners of their minds, where the echoes of screams still lived, Something human had died. What returned from the cryptia was not a soldier. It was the embodiment of the state's coldest truth, that fear itself was Sparta's greatest weapon. At 30, the Spartan warrior was finally permitted to live with a wife. Yet even then, love was forbidden to bloom. The union was not for companionship or comfort. It was a continuation of duty. The man who had been forged by pain now faced a different kind of discipline, to breed strength without affection. Spartan women were not victims of this order. They were its pillars. From childhood, they were trained not to be fragile or obedient, but commanding and unyielding. They managed estates, issued commands, and spoke their minds freely, because their duty was not to please men, but to preserve Sparta's perfection. Weakness, they were told, was treason, pity a disease. They learned to despise softness, in themselves and in others. When their sons marched to war, they handed them their shields and said the words that defined a nation: return with it or upon it. To die with honor was triumph. To return in shame was betrayal. One tale tells of a Spartan mother who struck down her son with her own hand for fleeing battle. To her it was not cruelty, it was justice. Marriage in Sparta was a ritual, not romance. There were no flowers, no feasts, no songs. The ceremony was designed to suppress affection, to keep emotion from diluting the bloodline. On her wedding night, the bride's head was shaved, and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. She waited in darkness while her husband came quietly, completed his duty, and returned to the barracks before dawn. It was not passion. It was policy. The state believed secrecy kept desire alive, that what was forbidden was stronger, and that strength produced stronger offspring. Even love itself had been re-engineered into a weapon of the state. Spartan wives were equal in purpose, if not in tenderness. They ruled the home as their husbands ruled the battlefield. When the men were away, the women kept order, oversaw slaves, trained the children, and guarded the city's integrity. They did so without complaint, without illusion. For generations this system endured. Love replaced by loyalty, emotion by discipline, life by duty. Every marriage, every birth, every heartbeat in Sparta was another step in the endless cycle of perfection. And yet behind the pride and the power, something human was lost. They had forged the mothers of warriors, and unbreakable, unyielding, and silent. Women of iron whose hearts beat not for themselves, but for Sparta alone. For 3 centuries, the machine of Sparta ran with divine precision. It conquered Greece, silenced kings, and terrified empires. Its warriors seemed invincible, men of iron, molded by pain, purified by discipline. Yet within that same perfection, decay had already begun. For what Sparta called purity was, in truth, a slow and beautiful suicide. The first poison was blood itself. By condemning every weak infant, by purging all imperfection, Sparta carved its own extinction into the fabric of its future. Generation after generation, their gene pool grew smaller, thinner, weaker. Every fallen warrior on the battlefield was not just a soldier lost, he was the end of an entire bloodline that had taken decades to craft. There were no replacements, no second sons, no spare heirs. The nation that sought to breed strength had unknowingly bred fragility. The second poison was rigidity. The agoge had produced perfect followers, disciplined, unflinching, loyal beyond reason. But they were not thinkers. They did not innovate, they obeyed. When the world around them changed, and when new tactics, new weapons, and new ideas emerged, the Spartan machine could not adapt. It stood frozen, flawless, and blind to the evolution it had denied itself, and the final poison was victory itself. When Sparta crushed Athens, Persian gold poured into the city like a curse disguised as reward. Luxury replaced austerity. Wealth corroded the iron code that had defined them. Once every Spartan had been equal in poverty, bound by simplicity. Now greed took root. Land ownership concentrated, power corrupted, and arrogance began to rot the foundation of their unity. Then came the reckoning, the Battle of Leuctra. Theban general Epaminondas faced the myth of Spartan invincibility and shattered it. Instead of spreading his forces wide, he drove them deep. A wedge formation 50 men thick. It tore through the Spartan phalanx like a blade through parchment. Their king fell. Their lines broke, and centuries of domination ended in a single afternoon. The empire of warriors became a relic. By the time of Rome, Sparta was no longer a power, but a performance and a museum of memory. Travelers came to see the last echoes of discipline and cruelty, unaware they were standing among ghosts. In the end, Sparta achieved what it desired most: perfection. But perfection is sterile. It does not grow, it does not evolve, it does not feel. The machine that forged heroes devoured itself, leaving behind only ruins and the whisper of a greatness built on cruelty, undone by its own pursuit of purity.